After starting Patreon and my YouTube membership, I have given in and decided to do a lot of the cases that you've asked me to do, even those ones that I felt had been done to death, because you still want them. So I thought, I'm going to accommodate it. I have my membership, I have my Patreon. At the end of the day, you're asking for these, so it's your fault. Basically, I'm blaming you. As you'll know from my channel, I do crime content consistently on a Wednesday and a Sunday, but a lot of the cases that I cover are ones that you won't have heard of, purely because I think it's really important to give legacy to other crimes and victims, and also because I'm one of those people that doesn't tend to want to watch the same thing again and again and again, but that's just me. And hopefully the cases that I'm going to cover that you've asked for, and I've been doing quite a few recently, are ones that I'll still give you some added value to. Let me know in the comments if that's the case. Also, as you know, still recovering from nose surgery. Please note one side of my face doesn't move in the same way as the other because I'm still so flipping swollen. God, I need a holiday. Thanks to everybody for joining me here. If you're new to my channel, I do release crime content on Wednesday and Sunday. It is always crime related. Tends to be very deep dives. It would be great if you're new and you want to subscribe. Also get your notifications on, get involved in a live chat. I love my live chats. Kenny's Crime Cult is a very lovely place to exist, and I tend to be there and we have a good natter and talk about lots of things, from the crime that we're talking about on the video right through to, I don't know, what flavour cake we like. So today's video is going to be on Edward Theodore Gein. Again, lots of you will know who this killer is, but some of you will not, so strap in if you don't know about this case. So what we would say, of course, about serial killers before I even get into this video is that they are very rare, and aside from being very rare, virtually all of them will fit into a classification of being considered a sociopath or a psychopath. But there is also an additional layer possibility to these kind of serial killer crimes, and that is an individual who has the mindset of a serial killer, of course, but also the brutality of their crimes seems to indicate something even further than just the ordinary serial killer, sociopathic, psychopathic tendency we'd expect to see, and that is mental illness. And I bring that in because we can look particularly at disorganized serial killers like Richard Chase, for example, where you can literally look at the crime scene and see there's no organization, it's completely chaotic, they've not been sophisticated on a forensic level, and you can almost see that they're not thinking clearly in those crime moments. In fact, paranoia tends to play in, certainly to somebody like Richard Chase's types of crimes. He, by the way, was the vampire of Sacramento, so look him up if you're interested in hearing more about that story. I will cover him on this channel. But mental illness, certainly when it comes down to Gein, it definitely plays in. So let's look at who he was, what his life was like, and how essentially he was created. So his name fully was Edward Theodore Gein, which I think is more in fitting with being like President of the United States. It's a proper upstanding name, isn't it? Edward Theodore Gein. Doesn't work out that way. Doesn't work out that way. No matter what his hopes were in those initial periods as a child, or his parents looking at him and thinking, with a name like that, he's going to be a stand-up kind of guy, went horribly wrong. I'm going to tell you that before we start the story. Now, the case in point that we're talking about and the brutality of the murders that he committed basically earns him a very fitting name. The moniker is the Butcher of Plainfield. And I'll be honest, it is a name that was without doubt well deserved. So Gein was born on the 27th of August 1906. He was born in La Crosse County, which is in Wisconsin in the US. His mum, let's talk about the positives about his mother. First of all, let's talk about the tiny fragments of light shining through into her personality. She was a hard worker. Yeah, she was somebody who wasn't afraid of a good old day's hard work. She would support her family, and she actually had a pretty successful, it was small, but a pretty successful, perfectly formed grocery business. And she put the hours in, simple as. So she was somebody who at the time, with respect, may well have been expected to be home looking after her children, but actually was out making sure that they had a reasonable standard of living. Allegedly, Gein, at the age of 10, he actually witnesses his parents slaughtering a hog. This hog is in a shed, and he witnesses the killing of this animal, which, let me tell you, would leave me screaming and running for the hills, knocking on random neighbours' doors saying, "Do you have space for another child? I am abandoning my parents who've just put me through what can only be described as the most traumatic experiencing, witnessing something I compared to the killing of Babe from the movie." But that didn't happen for Gein. Gein watched his mother and father slaughter that hog, and he was sexually aroused by it. And I'm not just talking a little bit aroused. So aroused that on witnessing the scene play out, he ejaculated. At this point, bit of the first sign of an emerging disturbed mind, I will say. Most of us don't think, where shall we go to get sexually gratified? I know, the slaughterhouse! Although in my head now I'm thinking, if you were somebody who felt that way, it probably would be an appropriate job for you. But it's a very disconcerting thought that anybody would find that in any way stimulating. Family then ends up moving because mother, who we'll go into in a little bit of detail shortly, has some ideas about society, and not positive ones. So the family decide that they're going to remove themselves from more general society to a remote farm. This is in Plainfield, Wisconsin, and this is when Gein is around 8 years of age, so before he's realised that he has a penchant for watching people slaughter things and be turned on. Now, the area I have looked up, it's a really small, quiet town, and the population is only about 900, and I think most of you who are listening to me now will think that that's a tiny amount of people. It's an area that you would expect to know pretty much everybody, isn't it? Some of you, particularly in the States, you will live in areas that reflect small populations, and there are some really great things about that, because, you know, usually they're safe. Obviously not when Ed Gein moves in, but, you know, usually they're quite safe and they're close, connected, and have some really great opportunities to feel part of a population and community. But other people can look at that and think, wow, I really wouldn't want to have that intensity, because some people don't want everybody to know their business, and small town populations tend to do that. So it would be a big transition, going from having a grocery store, obviously serving the local community, to suddenly being in this quiet town, which was pretty isolated. And it was down to the fact that Gein's mother didn't trust society. In fact, she wanted to remove her family entirely from La Crosse. And the reason for this is she actually considered it to be a place of sin and immorality. She wants to try Manchester. I love Manchester, I live here. I'm just saying. What's wrong with a bit of sin and immorality occasionally? But she has this clearly very religious perspective, and her biggest fear when she's bringing up those boys is that they're going to end up getting corrupted by this immoral society around her. So this leads to Gein being raised on the isolated farm that they are living in. He's got an older brother, Henry, so he does have some company, so to speak. But that property, it had 155 acres of land, and the nearest neighbour was a mile away. That's a real seclusion of a childhood, isn't it? And whilst on one level you can say, well, it makes kids safe, they've got the landscape, nature, and I'm all for getting kids out there with nature, kind of think it's also helpful when there are other kids around, because you model your behaviour not just on your primary caregivers, you model your behaviour on your peers. You get to experience the world through the eyes of kids your age. You get to ask them questions that they answer usually incorrectly, but that means you can have conversations with them about different aspects and perspectives of the world. When you speak to your mums and dads, it's different. Firstly, they've got the bias of wanting to keep you safe. Secondly, they might have some bias based on their belief systems. And most importantly, they give you the answers that you take as facts. So you don't necessarily even become that discerning about thinking about your own belief systems if you don't have the interactions and engagements of peers your age. Also, just to say, ironically, when you think about the fact that Gein's mother had moved them all there to be safe, that seclusion itself, ironically, is going to allow Gein in the future to undertake some of the most depraved acts in criminal history, and to do it more terrifyingly in complete secrecy. So the very place that's meant to provide safety for Gein and his brother becomes a horror scene for victims. One thing that intrigues me a little bit is that in spite of the fact that Gein's mother was hardcore, and again we're going to explore that a little bit more in a minute, he idolised her, genuinely. And it wasn't as if he had this idolatry for her because she was just the kindest, most compassionate, most loving, most giving mum who just made him feel safe. That's not the case. He had a really challenging childhood. And this involved the family home itself, those members within it, living under her incredibly oppressive rule. His mother was called Augusta, which instantly you're like, ooh, Augusta. She doesn't sound like somebody who's going to take it easy on you. Just saying, you can't make assumptions from names. But if I was going to think about a hardcore character in any kind of book I wrote, Augusta would be the kind of name. Although now I'm thinking of Augustus Gloop, which is completely different and is Charlie in the Chocolate Factory. Still, he didn't take instructions well either, did he? He did things his own way, so maybe there is some kind of connection, very loosely, drawing that thread. Augusta was actually somebody, in spite of how much he adored her, and he adores her throughout his whole life, she was often verbally abusive to him and to his brother. They were routinely beat. She'd also mock them and shame them, so there was a very humiliating environment to be brought up in. So these are not the benchmarks of any type of good parenting, are they? This very domineering matriarch is somebody who seems to take pleasure from belittling her children. She was very much in charge of the household. Also, she was a fanatically religious person, and I mean fanatically religious. She's an old Lutheran. Now, an old Lutheran is somebody who basically looks at the world around them and is like, every single human being is a despicable, disgraceful excuse for a being. Everything they do is sinful. Genuinely, that's what this kind of belief system is. So the way that this type of theology is taught, so to speak, is that every single human thought and deed is infected with sin. Every single one. And instantly a lot of you will be like, that seems a little bit extreme. And you're like, yeah, and I've thought about this a lot. I studied RE for, that's religious education by the way, for A-level. I also did it in my first year degree alongside my psychology. I was really interested in the whole framework of religion and theology and all of the things that kind of connect people's understanding around the meaning behind why people hold doctrines so closely and need them so desperately. And there are so many great things that religion brings to our society. And it's like anything, isn't it? Moderate belief systems, and I'm not saying that it's wrong to believe in any particular doctrine, by the way, but I think moderation is really imperative, because as we've evolved consciously, we have started to see the world slightly differently. And for example, Christianity is a great one to put out there. It's a very accepting religion on the whole, and the same with Judaism, with Islam, with all of these when it's moderate. But when there is radical religions or fanatical religions, you often find it capsizes the benefits and ends up in a place where it's controlling and often scary for those who actually are faced with having to act in a way that sometimes feels impossible. And certainly Augusta is somebody who imparts that level of fear into the family, that there are all these teachings that she believes means that every single human thought is full of all types of terrible. And you're like, I'm not sure, Augusta, that makes sense. And I'm one of those people who likes things to have some linearity, because if I'm going to go out and do something deeply charitable, altruistic, caring, and I don't expect anything back apart from, of course, a level of satisfaction that I have an impact on the world that's positive, I don't know why that is going to be considered sinful. I guess Augusta would be like, well, you got some kind of gratification from doing that, so you should probably go and beat yourself, flagellate, because of the fact that you, at the end of the day, inherited a positive experience from being kind. You can't win in those situations. But that's the kind of thing that Old Lutheran is all about. It's about teaching people that every single thought, deed, every single experience that they conceive is all drenched in sin. And one of the things that Augusta in particular was hardcore on is that she wanted her boys to believe that women, and in particular sex itself, was just evil. Of course, she also wanted them to know that she wasn't evil, and clearly the sex that she'd had in having her kids also wasn't evil. It's a little bit on the confusing side, but hypocrisy tends to ring true in these kind of extremes. She also suggested that all women were prostitutes and vessels of sin. She sounds like a delight, doesn't she? She's the kind of person you're like, she needs to be on my Christmas card list. She seems like a real fun character to be around. But imagine having that kind of perspective. And also, what does that say about the mindset of Augusta? Because I think when somebody is that fanatical and when they drive an inference into every single thing with such negativity, there's something going on in their own mindset. It would not surprise me at all if she would not have benefited from some kind of psychiatric evaluation and possible treatment. One of the things that I think was wholly terrifying is that even as young boys, she would make the boys promise her that they would remain virgins. And that was all around trying to convince her boys that the world was just full of evil. Simple as that. And that a great deal of this evil came down to lust and carnal desires. Also, she would spend time every single afternoon reading her boys the Bible. But it wasn't parables, for example, teaching people about how to potentially be better people. It wasn't the New Testament about Jesus saying to everybody, like, peace and love, let's be kind to each other, let's think about our impact. No, it was all the Old Testament stuff. You know, it was about wrath, it was about divine retribution, it was about God being a judgmental ruler who essentially will send you to hell to burn in hellfire if you fail to abide by the very words of that testament. And I think that that's really scary for kids. Unlike Gein, Henry's older brother, he did actually sometimes stand up to his mother. And one of the reasons for that was he could see the way that Gein was starting to develop what he considered an unhealthy connection towards his mum. And he could see that the influence was growing. So as opposed to Henry, who kind of see that this was a whole heap of a little bit crazy and intense and maybe, shall we say, not true, Gein wasn't like that. It's as if he was buying into this belief system. And Gein became utterly subservient. And even though what I've just described to you for a lot of us would connect with an abusive childhood, that's not how Gein perceives it. He'd later describe Augusta as a saint. Literally, a saint. Low bar, Gein. Low bar. As far as saints, for me, few miracles. You know what I mean? Really nice individuals who tend to be canonized because of the fact that they were wonderful examples of humanity, as opposed to teaching you that sex is terrible, all women are whores, and basically you have to remain a virgin for the rest of your life or you're probably going to burn in hell. But yeah, that's how he described his mother. So early on, we are all able to agree that Gein's perspective about acceptable relationships is a little bit on the skewed side. I have to be honest as well, Gein's father, well, he wasn't exactly the shining role model of a parent that one would wish to have. He was a chronic alcoholic. We can all imagine that that would be very challenging to have a parent who literally was chronically dependent on alcohol. Also, the people who knew him said that one of the things about this particular man was that there was a real timid side. He was quiet. He didn't stand out as anybody who would challenge the status quo. And this is a complete contrast to his wife. One could argue he was potentially a little bit scared at times of her. But when he drank, as we know, when people are under the influence, it can change their behaviours and allow them to do things that are reprehensible. And that's no excuse, because essentially you have an option not to drink, but it tended to be that when he drunk, so he wasn't a violent person when not drunk, but at times when he was, he would physically abuse his sons. And I guess the fact that he's a violent alcoholic demonstrates that the environment itself is incredibly toxic. The boys clearly have total extremes. On one side, they have a punitive mother who tells them that basically behaviour is expected to be perfect if you are going to walk through the gates of heaven. And on the other side, you have her partner who is a raging alcoholic who's sometimes very aggressive towards them. So that juxtaposition as a household is deeply confusing, because why on earth is she with him? And those questions would certainly go through her sons' minds. Now, that father didn't have a lot of skills. He didn't. Because of his limitations, because of his personality, he was never really a role model that they could look up to. He wasn't very good at teaching them how to be a good man. He could never hold down a job. So again, that example was poor. And it's not as if he hadn't worked in the past. He had. One of the things that he previously worked as was tanning animal hides, which sadly is a skill that young Gein would pick up. And he would pick up that skill and sadly not use it to create furniture in the way that you or I would imagine somebody doing. But nonetheless, he put it to good use with pretty horrific consequences in later life. The household I've described, you can see how chaotic it would be and how dramatically different the caregivers are, but also this thread of violence running through its daily occurrence, and two boys who are being brought up confused and having this distorted view of the world pushed on them. Also, it's said that Augusta literally hated her husband. He was constantly held in complete contempt. And I'm not saying for 1 minute that you can blame anybody for making you an alcoholic, but I'm not sure if I was living with Augusta, I wouldn't be self-medicating with something. Genuinely. People like her make the world feel so utterly controlled that you are probably looking for some kind of escape. Like I said, you could argue, well, maybe he was the reason Augusta ended up so militant in her views, because she married with this man and he failed her on every level and she found comfort and solace in religion. It's not ideal, is it? And she could have divorced him. Of course she could have. But because she was so religious and those beliefs meant so much to her, she felt that she couldn't. So instead, she just remained bringing up her children in a horrifically toxic environment whilst making it clear that she hated the partner that she was married to. Not brilliant. The thing about those strict values and this iron fist with which she ruled that family is that even though I can be really negative towards her, and I can, because the toxicity level was high, at the same time you could argue, well, maybe she was creating this environment in a misguided way because she didn't want her sons to turn out anything like their father. Just throwing it out there, might not have been the case, but essentially that dismal opinion that she had of relationships full stop, and particularly of women, must have extended to men as well, and preventing her boys, in her mind, ending up that way could have been a motivation. One of the things that Gein experienced when he was 12 years of age was, let's say he was finding himself sexually. So he's just like having a bath, you know, discovering his body, completely normal. It's what normal kids do. Anybody who's ever had a child knows at some point they realise that masturbating and orgasms occur, and it is a revelation that lasts a lifetime. She catches him in the bath masturbating, and she is absolutely horrified. She is beyond angry, and she actually scolds him with hot water. She grabs his genitals, and then she calls those genitals the curse of man. Again, that fits in with this whole idea that people can't control their sexual behaviours, and now her son's at that age discovering his own sexual behaviours. She wants to make it clear to him that there is a level of shame. And whilst on one level that scene kind of is amusing to imagine just because Augusta seems this overbearing character in the way she calls him the curse of man, but actually for a child that would just be probably one of the most humiliating moments, terrifying because he would have felt like he'd let her down, and reinforcing because again, she's making it clear that this is sinful. So as opposed to doing what a normal, well-adjusted parent would do these days, which is be like, that's completely normal. In fact, you would apologise if you walked in because you've entered their private space and they are doing an activity they're entitled to, and it would be really important to let them know that there is a reassurance that that is completely normal. Don't feel embarrassed about it. Not that you'd want to go out and say, just go out and do that anywhere. That would be going too far. But clearly, as we've grown into more modern parenting, we know that communicating with our kids over those kind of sexual behaviours is really important to make them feel accepting of themselves. Now, Gein had, as I've described a little bit earlier on, a really isolated childhood. He didn't have any friends, really. And when he tried to make friends, on the occasion, I don't know, that somebody wandered past the farm, it was really frowned on. His mum punished him. She literally would punish him for trying to make gains of any type with any child. And this meant that he'd only ever leave the farm to go to school. So he didn't have peer relationships that he was allowed to carry on at home. He didn't have a lot of peer interaction and intervention at home at all. So he didn't develop the social skills that you would require. So when he goes to school, he's really different. And the peers that remember Gein when he was in education said that he was really shy and he was a really socially awkward individual. And one imagines that would be because of the tyrannical experience of living at home and the lack of interaction of anybody other than his family members. Also, there was a strange behaviour that people noted about him. Often he would be seen thinking quietly, and then he just like inexplicably burst into laughter. It was like he was imagining something in his head and he was laughing out loud at his own private jokes. Sometimes I do that, I'm not gonna lie. Sometimes I do that. Do we do that? We do that, but usually it's when I'm on my own. It's not usually like in theatre or sat around a table eating my food with my family. Usually I'm by myself, but that lends us insight into the fact that even when he was with others, he probably felt very much by himself, so he didn't have those boundaries because he was so used to his own company. Also, he got bullied at school, and part of this was because he looked and seemed and acted different, but also he had a speech impediment. He had a lesion on his tongue, and that lesion on his tongue actually caused him to speak a little bit strangely. He had a lazy eye because he had a growth on his left eyelid, and that meant that kids took aim at him. So it would have been difficult for him because one, he's got this really isolated upbringing, and then when he gets the opportunity to be around his peers, which could be an opportunity for learning, growing, changing, connecting, actually he gets singled out more just because he looks and sounds a little bit different. And sometimes he would arrive back home crying. And instead of getting the reassurance, the compassion, the love, the acceptance and understanding when he got home, in fact, instead of it being like, Mum, Dad, I've got bullied, and then Mum and Dad, where are you going? Why are you getting your coats? Why are you heading in the direction of the school? Because that's what a lot of us would do. We'd be like, I'm gonna find the teacher who's letting this happen. I'm gonna have a quiet word because I don't think it's okay to have a quiet word with the 8-year-old kid who's doing it. But that's what a lot of parents feel like. It provokes that reaction. No, not for Gein. Because he was bullied, his father saw this as weakness, and the tears just provoked violence. On one occasion, he would beat him around his ears so aggressively that Gein would be left with his ears ringing. Academically, he didn't fare too badly. He was an average student, but he was seen to be an absolutely excellent reader. So he wasn't a child with academic problems. And again, we have to acknowledge that he didn't have a great deal of support at home. So it's not that he couldn't have excelled in certain areas, it's that he didn't really get the opportunity to do so. Also, when you're an excellent reader, I think that for any of you out there who read loads and loads of books when you were a child, sometimes we use it as a form of escape. It lets us go to a different world. It's a place that we can control. And it also means that we have activities to do that distract us from, I suppose, boredom, but also sometimes it's a self-soothing mechanism. If life isn't perfect and you can suddenly find yourself lost in a book, for just a period of time, you have the opportunity to truly escape. And in Gein's case, it would also have created a better vocabulary, and you'd imagine that that would give some insight into somebody with potential if things hadn't taken a dark, macabre, despicable twist. Now, when Gein gets into his 30s, after this relatively isolated, challenging, toxic environment, his entire life changed. And that's because his family all died within the space of a few years. So the first member of his family who died was his father. That was in 1940, and his dad died basically of heart failure because of the alcoholism. At this point, Gein was 34. Now, after his father's death, he and his brother start going around and just doing odd jobs to bring in extra cash. Obviously, they want to help their mother. They're still living at home, so making sure that they can become useful in their local community and bring that money in is something that they commit to. They were considered strange in their local community, but they were also, and this is important, they were considered honest and they were considered hardworking. So even though they were quite awkward, they were the type of people who would turn up on time, get the job done, it would be done to a decent standard, and you could trust them. But even though Gein and his brother are working together, another tragedy, shall we say, I say tragedy, just hold that thought for a minute. Gein's brother Henry, so he dies. Now, Henry at this point was not in the same space as Gein. He was actually thinking about moving in with a divorced mother of two. In fact, he was due to move in to this home with a divorced mother of two, which you can imagine would go down with his mother like a lead balloon, and even with Gein, because Gein's been brought up believing that women are just these sexual deviants, and he's watched his own mother say in a loveless, toxic marriage, because at the end of the day, you're married for life, till death do us part, and here his brother is about to move in with a woman who's failed in a marriage and has two children, and also Henry wasn't married to her. So this is a whole heap of sin, potentially in Gein's eyes, certainly in his mother's eyes. And Henry also starts to have conversations with Gein about the unhealthy attachment that he believes he has to his mother. He feels like it has been a relationship that over the years has become so fused. And Henry mocks Gein about this relationship. He is somebody who genuinely takes the piss, which would be very, very difficult for Gein, because bear in mind, he idolizes this woman. And he'd also criticised his mother when he was in conversations with Gein, and it was not well received. It was not well received. Perhaps, unsurprisingly, one could say, it wasn't long after that he died in mysterious circumstances in 1944. Henry was apparently killed in a fire. He and Gein were burning brush on the farm, which is something that farmers do. Fire apparently is out of control. It can happen, of course it can happen. They call the fire department, I should say Gein calls the fire department. Henry is nowhere to be seen at this point. And they arrive, they extinguish the flames, but after they've left, Henry is nowhere to be found. Bear in mind they were burning this together. There's been a fire, Now Henry is missing, just after saying some nasty things about his mother. So Gein then reports him missing, and obviously authorities turn up, search party arrives, and even though Gein has called and said, my brother's missing, when the search party arrives, it seems that he was just able to take the entire search party to the exact spot where his brother's body was located. I mean, at that point, I'd be like, why did you call us? For a start, that would be question one. Secondly, how do you know where he is? Thirdly, I'd be like, why is he face down in the marsh if there's been a fire? Because that's how they found him, face down in a marsh. And they were like, he's face down in a marsh. How did he die? He probably asphyxiated due to smoke inhalation. I'm not sure that would be the appropriate diagnosis these days. He's face down in a marsh, outside. I mean, I think you're pushing it a little bit with the idea of the smoke inhalation at this point. It's not in a forest fire. Also, no evidence he'd been burned. But you know what they did find in this? He died of smoke inhalation. They discovered that Henry had bruises to the back of his head. Yeah. At this point, surely they would be like, hang on a minute, let's just add this up a minute. Henry was with Gein. Gein said he disappeared. Then he led us to the body. Then the body wasn't burned. And then there were bruises on the back of the head. Do you potentially think somebody murdered him? That's like ABC, isn't it? And actually, people did think that maybe Henry had died before the fire, but they were like, oh, well, even though all of that makes sense, and we all kind of think that maybe Henry died before the fire, we should probably just rule it as a tragic accident. That makes sense, less paperwork. So that's what happened. And one of the reasons for that is because the only other person around was Gein. Now, nobody suspected for 1 minute that this softly spoken, unassuming, bit awkward, but kind of nice guy who did jobs around the local community was possibly capable of killing anybody. And to some degree, they were so convinced by this that they didn't even carry out an autopsy. The fact that no autopsy was ever performed, and bearing in mind all of the atrocities that I'm going to go on to talk about and that Gein went on to commit, I think that the conclusion that they came to is one of those that should have been reconsidered without a doubt. For me, Gein murdered his brother, and murdered his brother for two reasons. One, because he was very angry with the way that he was responding about his mother, making fun of him and his relationship with his mother, but also because he was about to move in with this woman. It feels a bit like a Cain and Abel type scenario, and that has been suggested in the past. And for me, that is a far more likely explanation as to how Henry ended up dead. So we have Gein and his mother in the house by themselves. They're on this massive farm alone. But not long after Henry dies, Augusta actually suffers a stroke. And that stroke itself partially paralyzes her. And I will note that Gein became an absolutely devoted carer. And he was somebody who committed to looking after her, protecting her, meeting every single need that she had. One of the things that somebody actually witnessed, that again, just to add in a little bit about Augusta and what I've told you about this really fanatically religious mindset that she had, is on one occasion they actually called at a man's property. It was to buy straw, basically. And there was a man called Smith who lived at that property, and he basically begins to beat a dog. Now, a woman at this point appears from Smith's house, telling Smith to stop beating this dog. Damn straight he should. But he just beat the dog to death in front of them. Now, Augusta is absolutely blindsidedly upset by these events. But the reason that she was blindsided and distressed by what had played out was nothing to do with the fact that this poor dog had been senselessly beaten to death by this man. It was that Smith and the woman who'd come out of the house were not married. That's a whole heap of going down the completely wrong avenue, perception-wise. That's what she was upset by. The whole situation of this poor defenseless animal being horribly beaten and killed just didn't figure. She was like, I cannot believe that man beating that poor defenseless animal to death with a stick is living in sin. Anyway, that's the kind of mindset that Gein was being brought up with all those years. Now, the following year after that event, Augusta actually suffers a further stroke, and unfortunately she dies at this point. That's in 1945. So that's a very short amount of time that Gein has literally lost his entire family. Lost a stroke, killed one of them, but nonetheless, he's now left alone on the farm, and that farm is exactly where he remained. His life just got more and more isolated. He didn't leave the farm. He had absolutely no friends. He never dated women at all. His mother's puritanical teachings, those threats of damnation, they had affected him massively. And he was so consumed by this really warped and harsh view of the world. And it's as if even though she was dead, she was still controlling him from the grave. And I think that this is really what plays out in many of the crimes that we're going to talk about, that her presence is never truly gone from Gein's world. And to say that her death had a big impact on him is like a massive understatement, because when she died, she was his only friend. Yeah, she treated him at times, in my opinion, reprehensively, but remember, he idolized her. And people said that she was his one true love. And he was totally devastated. He completely depended on her for all of his guidance in life. And remember, she was a saint in his eyes. She was perfect. She was his infallible savior. Now she's gone. And suddenly, he's completely alone in this strange world, a lonely world that she created for him. He'd got no identity of his own because his mother had molded him according to exactly what she believed was appropriate. He'd never had the opportunity to thrive as an individual. She had made him believe that he had to be A, B, C to be accepted, and he had fulfilled that. So when she is gone, he is anchorless. And it's at this point we start to see that this mental health that obviously at times, to some degree, he'd had some struggles with, from the reports of bullying, his strange behaviours, the way that arguably he treated his brother. There could potentially have been declines prior to this, but it feels like there is a complete deterioration after she dies, and he basically becomes a complete recluse. But even though Augusta is now no longer present, as I've noted, the worship of his mother really did not end with her death. In fact, I would say that one of the things that is very clear and prevalent in this case is that Gein never accepted the fact that Augusta was dead. One of the things that he did was seal off the rooms that she frequently used. So he made them into some kind of shrine, so to speak. He literally blocked off the use of any of those places that he familiarized himself as being hers. So her room in particular, that remained completely untouched. It was preserved exactly as she'd left it. Exactly. So he sealed off the entire upper floor, the downstairs parlour, and the living room. So that's basically the majority of the house. And then Gein moves into this small bedroom, which is just off the kitchen. It's no surprise, by the way, that he would later become the inspiration for Robert Bloch's character Norman Bates in his 1959 novel Psycho. I think we can all agree there are some hallmarks of why you may draw inspiration from the case that I'm talking about right now, particularly the mummy issues we're discussing. So obviously these rooms that he is now sealed off, they're gonna stay in perfect order. They're neat and tidy because his mother had been involved in them, and obviously while she had been alive, he did what was ever required to make sure that she was cared for. But the rest of the house that he has access to, it just literally falls into squalor and disrepair. And it's a bit like he's hoarding, it becomes filled with rubbish, piled up furniture. That is just such a stark contrast to the orderly house that his mother used to keep, well, used to demand as well. He also became really physically unkempt, and one of the things that was noted was that he just stopped bathing entirely, and people would comment on the fact that he smelt so bad. And when you think about mental health decline, one of the things that we look for is somebody's self-care really dropping. So when people are being highly unhygienic, when people just don't really care about their bodies whatsoever, arguably there are self-esteem issues there, they're not taking care or feeling a sense of worth for their body, and it's certainly an indicator of somebody starting to struggle. So Gein is fitting this in this moment in time, and people are noticing it. So we're seeing this drop in Gein's mental health, but at the same time, he starts getting really interested in reading books on anatomy. On one level, why not? Anatomy books are very interesting. I love reading about physiology. I'm sure a lot of you out there do too. But we're probably not doing it because we're thinking, oh, just gonna learn about brain surgery today. Why? Just thinking I might do some home brain surgery. On who? Just some unsuspecting neighbour maybe. You know, when it comes down to those kind of interests, we have a whole heap of concern to place on said individual. And unfortunately, Gein is gonna fit this category. And I told you earlier on, he's a very good reader. So he's quick to learn. And the whole premise of him starting those anatomy books is because he has plans, doesn't he? So whilst he's in a mental health decline, it doesn't mean that he can't assert some visions that he wants to complete in the future. Now, because Gein was so isolated, he's just left to his own devices for like the next 10 years. And during that 10 years, he would create a depraved, macabre world. It was real. It was a real depraved, macabre world, but it was like something out of a horror film. It's why horror films have been made to reflect his story, because it's beyond the realms for the average human being to even begin to conceptualize and conceive how anybody can carry out the kind of things that we're going to talk about next. Also, I think he began to lose complete connection with reality. He was becoming more and more deranged. He spiraled into insanity. And remember, he's got this, shall we say, unhealthy interest now in anatomy, but he's also become, during this period, during this decade, really obsessed with Nazi medical experiments. He also was interested in atrocities about stories on cannibalism, pornography, horror movies. Bear in mind, he's constantly looking at that literature. And then combine that with declining mental health, his very rigid views about the sins of the world around him. And it's like, in that isolation, the perfect storm is created. But even if you were looking into Ed Gein at that point and being like, Ed, I think you need to get out a little bit more, maybe socialize, maybe put the books down a little bit, or I don't know, maybe start reading some lighter material. Even if at that point they'd looked in and seen his world, they would have had absolutely no idea just how far those twisted interests had gone. Because Gein wasn't just reading about these bizarre issues. In fact, because he'd been left alone, he'd been fully able to indulge in his sick, warped fantasies literally for years. So this isn't a guy who's just got an interest in these darker areas of life. This is his manual. He was educating himself. He was skilling himself. Now, obviously, he'd had to earn money. His whole family's dead. It means he has to bring in some kind of income to make sure that he can eat and live. And the way that he does this is he completes odd jobs for people. You'll be quite surprised at some of the jobs that he did. So some of the more obvious ones that an individual could do as a bloke: worked for the local municipal road crew and crop threshing crews in the area too. Also, to make a bit of extra income, he sold a piece of land that had previously been owned by his brother, who he killed. Bizarrely, by the way, like I said, maybe one of the jobs you would not have imagined that Gein was employed for was babysitting. Yeah, he also earned money as a babysitter, because of course, who better to look after your precious child than the weird recluse who lives alone at the farm and who doesn't wash? Is it just me? Do you know what I mean? I really want to go out this Saturday night, but I can't get my mum to sit for me. Have you thought about babysitter? I mean, what? Who? How? Well, I mean, as long as it's somebody who's an upstanding citizen, trustworthy, obviously somebody who's known to be conscientious, somebody who isn't odd and can be trusted. If you can think of anybody like that, we can go out on Saturday night. There is that really weird, smelly loner who seems to have a penchant for reading books that are scary. I'm going to ask Gein. That literally happened. Now, in fairness, turns out that Gein actually enjoyed babysitting, and they believe that the reason for this is because of his, to some degree, emotional immaturity, but also because he related better to children than adults. He was potentially seeing children as innocent. Remember, his mum had brought him up to imagine that people were just full of sin, but I think that children probably weren't considered quite in the same category. And the locals who allowed him to look after their beautiful children, they just felt he was a little bit odd, but harmless. At the end of the day, how wrong they were. And also, I'm not sure I buy into the idea that he just really got on with kids and didn't have any negative intent towards them. I just think that if you're babysitting for somebody, if their child disappears, clearly they're going to be looking directly at you. So I'm not suggesting for 1 minute that those kids were ever truly safe. What happens is, in that small community, things start to go a little awry. Because during the following years, after Gein's been left with no family, well, how can I put it? Residents just begin to mysteriously disappear. Now, one of those residents was Mary Hogan. She ran a tavern in Pine Grove, and it was nearby Gein's property, and that was actually a place that he regularly frequented. She just vanishes. 1954, just disappears. And they instantly suspect that there's been some kind of foul play. And the reason for that is because they see blood on the tavern floor. Also, they see an empty shell casing. So they don't actually find her body, but the assumption is that somebody has taken a firearm in there and there is blood on the floor and she is no longer, shall we say, to be found. So it makes sense that she has been murdered or met some kind of foul play, but certainly a crime had been committed, but they can't find the body. Then on the 16th of November 1957, 58-year-old widow Bernice Worden, she goes missing, vanishes. She was running a hardware store in Plainfield, and they also noted that the cash register had also been taken, so a robbery. But what was really striking for them and very worrying was that there was a trail of blood, and that was leading out the back of the store. So again, it looks like Bernice has met her end in some horrible way. Bernice's son, however, Frank, he was a deputy sheriff. Now he's immediately suspicious of Gein, immediately. And the reason for that is that he knew that Gein had reportedly visited the store the night before and arranged to collect a gallon of antifreeze the next morning. So as far as her son was concerned, he felt that Gein would be the last person her Bernice had seen before she vanished. Also, they find the sales slip for the antifreeze, and that's the last receipt that she's written. So because of this, the authorities decide to go and check out, bit of a hint there about crime. Probably not best to see off, the mother of somebody involved in the authorities, like the police. Obviously, even though they care about every death, there's going to be a really, really intense investigation when a deputy sheriff's mother has disappeared, aren't there? Obviously, Gein hadn't thought that through. So they go to Gein's properties. He's not home, but they finally do apprehend him. He's at the grocery store. The same night, they head to Gein's home because they want to conduct a search. And this is where the horror begins to unfold. When the police enter this really run-down, dilapidated property, they walk into something straight out of a nightmare. It is genuinely like a scene from a real-life horror film. And to be fair, they didn't really have big horror movies back in the day, did they? Nowadays, we're used to it. But for those officers, this was not something that they had ever come into contact with before. Also, it's not like it's difficult to see that some very dark things have played out, because very quickly they find the missing local woman that they're looking for. They actually find Bernice in the shed. She's not alive, she's very much dead. But it's not just that they find her body, it's what has happened to her body. So first of all, she's been decapitated, but the way that her body has been dealt with is it's been hung upside down from the rafters. There's a rod through her ankle joints and she'd been disemboweled. They put it that she had been gutted like a deer. Her body was open from the pelvis to the sternum. Her organs were in a bucket, and they were able to establish pretty quickly that she'd been shot and killed with a .22 caliber rifle, and then she'd been mutilated. They found her head in a sack, and they found her heart, and her heart was discovered in a plastic bag in front of a stove. To those police, that scene unfolding would have been completely and utterly out of the ordinary. Bear in mind what we're talking about, this tiny population. People know each other. These kind of crimes don't happen. People don't disappear. But certainly people don't, in these jobs, expect to walk into a scene that very few individuals will ever see in their lifetime. But in this particular place, in this particular space, to a place where the guy is known to be the kind of person who goes and does odd jobs in the community, somebody that people know. And there's this woman's body mutilated, and also mutilated in a way that suggests that this person knows what they're doing. They then look in the rooms that Gein actually occupied, and they were in complete disarray. So they start searching through all the rubbish, through all the furniture, and then they start making horrifying discovery after horrifying discovery. And they start realizing that Ed Gein has been getting up to some of the most darkest and macabre behaviors that they could have ever imagined, because it transpires that for years, Gein has been robbing graves for human body parts. He wanted to fulfill these sick fantasies, and he'd been going around mostly 3 local graveyards. He'd exhumed the bodies, and he'd done that pretty much as quickly as they'd been buried. So very soon after they'd been buried, he'd gone. In some cases, he'd even gone and taken the body before the grave had even been completed. Amazing that he would just check out what was going on at those grave sites and then intervene to remove the body. And through stealing those bodies, through being a body snatcher, he had just created this astonishing array of household objects by taking these body parts. Also, he had created items of clothing, and I'm going to go through so that you understand the kind of things that he'd made, what they found. So gloves made from human skin. He'd made chair seats that were made with leg bones and dried fat. He had other chairs that were actually upholstered in human skin. He had a wastebasket made of skin. He had leggings made from human skin. He'd made masks from women's faces. He had a human vest that had breasts attached. He made a belt that was made fully from women's nipples. He had a pair of lips that he'd actually made to use as a window shade drawstring. Also, he had a corset that he'd made of a female torso. It had been skinned from shoulder to the waist and made into this bizarre corset. He had a lampshade that had been made from human faces, and then he got lots of utensils that he'd made from bones. So the investigators are just turning up more and more of these items. On top of that, they start finding various dismembered body parts. So they find women's fingernails, they find 4 noses, ears, they find the genitals of 9 different women in shoeboxes. They find 2 teenagers' vaginas. They find a girl's dress as well. They notice that he's got skulls inserted on the bedposts. And where other skulls were concerned, he'd actually sawn the top off and made them into bowls. Yeah, bowls. Imagine having your Rice Krispies. I mean, genuinely, this is unbelievable. I'm saying the words, I'm telling you the story, but the pictures I'm getting in my mind right now are just harrowing. And then they go looking around the land, of course they do, and they've got more bones being found there. They find a skull and it's got a gold tooth in it, so they think that, unlike a lot of the body parts that they found, actually belong to a man. One of the things that is important to know is that when he gets questioned about all of these body parts, he says that he wants to make it clear that he never had any kind of sexual connection with the corpses, so there's no necrophilia involved. He said the reason that he didn't want to engage in any sexual practices with the corpses was that they smelt too bad. And he even went on to tell the police that he was in fact still a virgin. Also, a lot of people have suggested that he was a cannibal, but he denied this entirely. He said that he'd never cannibalized any of the body parts. The police are also able, during this investigation, to find the connection with the missing Mary Hogan. She'd vanished 3 years previously. They found her remains in Gein's property. And I hate to have to tell you this, but Mary Hogan wasn't just murdered by him, he had then made her face into a mask. They found that in a paper bag, and they found her skull in a box. So now they know that she had disappeared at the hands of Gein. When Gein was arrested, he initially just refused to speak to the investigators whatsoever, denied everything when he eventually does start to speak, which you can imagine got you for the interviewer. Mr. Gein, we have been to your house and we have found various body parts and lots of furniture from said body parts. Do you know anything about this? I know absolutely nothing about it. It's in your house. I don't know who goes in my house sometimes. All I do is come and go. It's not my fault if somebody comes in and decides, I don't know, to tan bodies and make lampshades from them. Makes perfect sense. You're free to go. Anyway, he does deny everything in that moment, but then he starts getting questioned and he ends up confessing to everything. So he starts telling the police that he was a body snatcher, and he says that the very first body that he actually dug up was his mother. That was about 18 months after she died. And we all know that he had this massive connection, idolatry, love of her, and clearly he would have been missing her massively. But the idea of thinking, well, look, how I'm going to handle my grief is I'm just going to go get a body. I'm just going to go and get a body. That'll solve it. I'll just go, dig my mum up, bring her home. 18 months. Can't imagine she was in the best state, but that's where this begins. So he takes the body home, he removes her head, and then he shrinks it. Yep, that's what he did with his mum's body, obviously so that he could keep at least a little bit of her. I don't know, have her cremated, keep the ashes would have been, in my opinion, a slightly better way of dealing with it. Anyway, he manages to shrink the head because of course he's learnt about all these topics. So he followed the instructions that he'd learnt. Then he tells police that this had kind of sparked something in him, and he starts making lots of trips to cemeteries. In fact, he said he made at least 40 nocturnal trips, and that's how he'd amassed this collection. It had taken place over a 5-year period. I often wonder when the police are interviewing these kind of people, how they can compose themselves, because can you imagine listening to this kind of narrative playing out and you're sitting there thinking, I've just seen a belt made out of nipples and some poor disemboweled victim literally hanging from a roof, and now this sicko is telling me he's been body snatching. It must be so traumatizing, genuinely. He starts to say to the police, even though he's confessing the fact that he is the person responsible for doing all of this, that he felt that when he carried it out, these kind of body snatching exploits, he often felt like he was in a daze. So he was taking bodies from the graveyard, but he wasn't consciously connecting with it. Sometimes he said he would be at the graveyard and he'd suddenly kind of snap out of this gaze, and then he'd just go home, and he'd go home with nothing. But on other occasions, he would go and he would take bodies. He'd take pieces of bodies, or he'd take entire corpses. He then would stick to the same MO. He would skin the bodies, he would tan the flesh, as I mentioned earlier on. His father's experience of tanning hides was clearly something that Gein had picked up on. And this meant that he was then able to make this vast array of macabre items. According to Gein, what he would do is he would spend time studying obituaries. Just as a side note, when I was a young person and we didn't have the internet and we used to get our local paper, I used to scan the obituaries. Don't know why. Used to like reading the nice things that people would write. Also, I think it was to do with the fact I used to like to imagine what the average age was for death. I'd be like, oh, we're doing well. They're over 80, they're over 80. And that kind of reassured me that I had a long life. But I think a lot of people read obituaries. But then he would use that as an opportunity to select recently buried women. And these recently buried women would reflect the similar age that his mother was when she died. And he had this desire to create a woman suit. He claimed that he was literally trying to create a woman suit out of this skin. And that would mean that he could crawl into this skin and then literally become his mother. Norman! Sorry, it's inappropriate, but you know what I mean. Psycho. It's kind of contextual in this moment. Anyway, he's confessing at this point to all these things. He even confesses to placing female genitalia over his crotch as if he were a woman. And he claimed that on occasion, he'd actually dressed in this skin suit and danced around when it was the full moon. It's not exactly a scene that you'd want to see if you were out camping, is it? He also claimed, if it isn't terrifying enough what I've told you so far, that on one occasion, he dressed in this skin suit and he danced around when it was a full moon. It's not a sight that you'd want to come across if you were camping, is it? So investigators obviously want to corroborate whether Gein is telling the truth about these body snatching experiences and exploits. So they go and exhume the graves, and indeed it corroborates Gein's claims. So one of the caskets is empty. There is like a crowbar, so clearly he's prized the grave open with it, but other graves were empty of the bodies. They just had artifacts left in them, so jewellery and dentures. Gein had actually been very thorough. When he was leaving the graves, they didn't look like they'd been robbed. He made sure that they looked like they had been carefully placed back, the earth on top, etc. Everything looked untouched, so no one suspected a thing. And remember, it's a small population, it's not a busy area, so him being seen in graveyards at late nights wouldn't have been something that would have occurred. Now, crucially, during the investigation, and rightfully, he does confess to 2 murders. So he admits that he killed Bernice Worden, and he says he killed her with his Marlin 22 rifle. He'd even planned her murder. He said that he'd waited around outside a hardware store, just waiting for the right opportunity to strike. And he ends up shooting her to kill her in the back of the head. Gein then also goes on to say, yeah, I did actually kill Mary Hogan 3 years earlier, and he'd shot her in her forehead. He'd used a .32 Mauser pistol, and that was when they were both alone in her tavern. That was the shell casing that they found at the scene, and they were able to then match that to Gein's gun. He then dragged her body back to his home on the sledge. The reason that Gein had become so obsessed with Mary in particular was because he felt that she bore a striking resemblance to his mother. I have to note, that was where the similarity between puritanical stroke tyrannical stroke absolutely religious zealot ends in his mother, because Mary had a reputation as a foul-mouthed libertine. Mary and me would have got on. I like a foul-mouthed libertine. So she was nothing like this fanatically religious Augusta. Unbelievably, Gein's initial confession to the police was actually considered inadmissible, which you can imagine would be a little bit annoying for the investigators. I can imagine it would be like, are you sure that it's inadmissible? Is it really inadmissible? It's totally inadmissible. It was inappropriate the way the confession was gained. Okay, so did somebody badly behave? They did badly behave. But does that deny the fact that this man has confessed to murdering 2 women, one of whom we found literally strung up in his shed, the other we found her face in a bag? Also, he's admitted to robbing the graves, told us where the graves are, and their bodies are no longer there, and they're, I don't know, a lampshade in his home. Surely we can just stretch and say the confession is valid. No, it's not. Genuinely. That literally happened. And the reason for this is that Wishara County Sheriff Art Schley, well, allegedly during Gein actually being questioned, he got a little bit hands-on. Apparently he slammed Gein's head into a wall. I think that I can have unusually some empathy for this particular law enforcer. It turns out that he had been ultimately and utterly traumatized by what he'd seen in Gein's home. He just was so angry and desperately broken by the scene that played out when the discoveries were made. So clearly it was inappropriate the way that he acted. But imagine having to look at that stuff. I mean, there's no reason for violence in an interrogation, but arguably when it comes down to whether that was admissible or otherwise, you kind of think, well, let's be honest, he's admitted it and it all fits in line. He is banged to rights, but like I said, he had to be interviewed again. And also, Art Schley, that particular individual, he died literally a year afterwards, just before Gein's trial actually. He was aged 43. So people said that, you know, just being witness to those horrors, combined as well with the fear of being questioned about the assault in court, that all culminated in it becoming just far too much for him to bear emotionally, and he died. When Gein is charged, he was ultimately charged with 1 count of first-degree murder. That was in 1957, and that was in relation to Bernice's killing. I don't know why they decided there was no point incurring the expense of prosecuting him for Mary's murder too. I don't know. I'm going to throw it out there. Maybe to give Mary's family a sense of justice and not be like, oh well, Mary died horribly too, but you know, it's pretty costly to acknowledge that, so let's just charge him with Bernice's killing. But literally that's what happened, in spite of the fact that he openly admitted it. Ultimately, when he gets to court, he pleads not guilty by reason of insanity. And the psychiatrist who assessed him said, this is a guy who genuinely is unfit for trial. During this period of time, he was actually diagnosed with schizophrenia. And experts also concluded something you won't be surprised at. They said he was a sexual psychopath with an abnormally magnified attachment to his mother. Seems his brother Henry was incredibly correct there. So then he gets detained at Central State Hospital for the criminally insane. It's also suspected as well that even though Gein was just charged with that particular offence, that he's also behind several other unsolved disappearances that had occurred in that region. So this includes the 1953 disappearance of a 15-year-old. She was called Evelyn Hartley, and she was a lacrosse babysitter. Evelyn was a daughter of a professor. She'd been looking after a 20-month-old baby girl when she just vanished from the house. And it's really sad, this, because one of the things that led to her babysitting was that her mother insisted that she go that night. She hadn't wanted to, she just hadn't been feeling it, but her mother felt that she had to acknowledge that she committed to do so, so she went. I imagine that her poor mum and her dad must just feel so bleak when they had to live the rest of their lives knowing that if she hadn't gone there, she would probably have got to have that future that she so deserved. They established when they started to investigate that crime that they could see someone had broken in through a window at the back of the house because every single door in the property had just been locked. That was aside from the basement door. Also, they noted that inside the house there were clear signs of a struggle. There was furniture, there were other items strewn about, things had been moved throughout the house. They noted that the radio had still been being played loudly, so clearly she'd been taken by surprise, and sadly for the family, they must have known that something terrible had happened to her because they found blood both inside the property and they found blood outside the property. The only signs that they actually found left of Evelyn were her shoes and her broken glasses. They did recover her clothes. They found her clothes that were all bloodstained and they were all at different locations. One of the things that is merciful is that the child that she was looking after at the time was thankfully found asleep and unharmed. And the police were able to establish later on down the line that Gein had been visiting a relative just a few blocks away from where Evelyn was babysitting that night on that evening. But Gein's always denied any involvement. And in fact, he has gone on in his lifetime to pass 2 lie detector tests. I will be honest, look, jury's out on lie detectors anyway, aren't they? Anybody who watches things like Dr. Phil, or in the UK we used to have Jeremy Kyle, these kind of shows where people ultimately pass or fail. It's not a perfect science. In fact, the belief is that lie detector polygraph tests can be like between 50 and 65% accurate, so you may as well toss a coin a lot of the time. But arguably, some people really buy into this. And the problem with a lie detector test when you're dealing with somebody, for example, who is schizophrenic, well, they could potentially pass the lie detector test if they are questioned about something that concerns a delusional belief. So they would be able to have a false belief and hold that false belief rather than actually lie. So arguably he could have passed it just because of these delusions that he didn't do it, as opposed to an acceptance that he did. It's also worth saying though that they didn't ever find any of Evelyn's remains at Gein's house, and to some degree, even though there is a link with him and suggestions that he could potentially have done it, her disappearance is still considered a mystery right to this day, which is really sad. Now, at one point, Gein was also suspected in the 1947 disappearance of an 8-year-old. That's Georgia Jean Weckler. She just vanished. She came from Fort Atkinson, Wisconsin. She was just on her way home from school. The only connection with her disappearance as far as a potential suspect was concerned was they noticed that there were some tyre tracks left at the scene and they matched a Ford car. Now, incidentally, Gein drove a Ford sedan. Again, he was ultimately cleared of any involvement due to a lack of evidence. I suppose we could argue that as far as normal victims that he was interested in, 8-year-olds were potentially not his MO, but he did have a Ford sedan, he was killing people, they found teenagers' body parts at his residence, so who knows whether he was the person who took her life. The same conclusion was made about 2 hunters. So there were 2 hunters, one was called Victor, he was known as Bunk Travis, and Ray Burgess. Now they disappeared in Plainfield in 1951. They never found any trace of either of those bodies. But they did find a jacket near the Gein property that belonged to one of them. I strongly suspect that there is a potential that he was the individual who took their lives, because it was around his property, the jackets found there, they were in the area, and we have a prolific killer and body snatcher operating in that area. But because of that, it's never actually going to be known, at least for certain, how many people Gein may have killed. So whilst Gein is actually detained, they look to sort out the farm, because clearly he's never going to be allowed to inhabit it again. He's going to be away inside in some facility for the rest of his days. They decide that they are going to look at auctioning his possessions and the farm. Even worse, and this could have only happened back in the days where freak shows were considered acceptable. You know, where if you had a bit of facial hair as a woman, they were like, freak. If you were somebody who maybe had issues with your height, you were a freak, and people would come and watch and laugh and point. Geez, can you imagine those days where that was ever seen as acceptable? But because we are talking about that time frame where people liked putting people who didn't fit the typical looks of society into freak shows, tourist attractions that invited people into another world were considered very profitable. And they even talked about the idea of making Gein's farm into a tourist attraction. They were going to call it the House of Horrors. Bear in mind, we're talking about a place where these victims, either live victims, were murdered and dismembered and made into furniture, or where the body parts of much loved family members who had been buried were stolen to be made into furniture. I mean, at the end of the day, to even imagine profiting from that kind of scenario is reprehensible. His possessions ultimately were auctioned off, which means that people actually bought them. I mean, genuinely, when you think about what you want to do with your cash, buying these kind of macabre things is not something that anybody should want to do. Any relationship with something so harrowing should not even be on the market. But in March 1958, this is before the house actually was sold, it burnt to the ground. Apparently, they couldn't figure out how the fire was caused, but it is suspected that it was arson. And I'm not somebody who thinks that arson is acceptable, but I do think on this occasion, that house burning to the ground was the best thing that could have ever happened. And they tell Gein that this has occurred, and he allegedly just shrugged and said, just as well. You're like, yeah, definitely, just as well. The car that he used, and this was the car, of course, that he used to transport the corpses from the graveyards, that was ultimately sold to a carnival sideshow. Ugh. Seriously? So creepy. People actually paid 25 cents to see the Plainfield Ghouls maroon 1949 Ford sedan. 25 cents, well spent, I don't think. It took about 10 years, just over 10 years, that Gein is declared fit to stand trial. The trial began on the 7th of November 1968, and when Gein was questioned about Bernice Worden's death, Gein claimed at the time he'd just been examining a gun in her store, as we do. Whenever I'm at the newsagent, if I'm not examining my gun, I don't know what I'm doing. Where else would you examine your gun than in a store? Seems perfectly reasonable. And then when he was just examining his gun, it just went off, and it killed her. So it's just a sad accident. At that point, though, he was asked, well, did you do this on purpose or was this an accident? But he wasn't able to actually confirm it. Basically, he said that he couldn't actually recall anything else that happened that day. Could be mental illness, could be just a little bit convenient. But he did remember just examining his gun in the store. After a week's trial, Gein's found guilty. Of course he is. But then they have to determine whether he is an individual who is actually guilty of being aware of his actions to some degree. So they have a further trial to determine his mental state. And at this point, he is found not guilty by reason of insanity. And that meant, of course, he didn't get off scot-free by any stretch of the imagination, but he instead is ordered to be detained at the Central State Hospital for the Criminally Insane. Now, during his detention, the people who worked with him, the people who interacted with him, I guess the people who forged friendships with him, they described him as an absolute model patient. He was mild-mannered, he was very helpful, but they also noted that at times he could become delusional when there was a full moon. Interesting. Now, some of you might find that very strange, but ironically, this is something that in psychiatry has been noted. So incidentally, for you, a little bit of trivia. Some of you might know this, but the word lunatic is actually derived from lunar, which obviously refers to the moon. And it was once believed, back in the day, that a full moon could literally send people mad. So even though in this day and age, it's not something that you would hear mental health practitioners talking about, that somebody can be affected by the moon, but certainly in the past, people believed there were influential behavioural patterns when there was a full moon. Now, in a way, one of the things that I'll note about Gein is that he probably flourished because of what happened to him when he was detained. You know, suddenly he went from complete isolation to an environment that likely had people around him, workers that could connect with him and communicate, jobs that he could do. But what also probably made him flourish was that there were some similarities to the isolated life that he incurred with his mother. Those strict rules, you know, having those clear boundaries and consequences, it worked for him. He lost that when his mother died, and we saw how he descended into this horrific type of behaviour. But being denied his liberty in a hospital for the criminally insane, it wasn't that different, was it? In fact, if anything, for Gein, it was better. It's always one of those strange dichotomies of feeling, isn't it? When we're talking about somebody who's carried out some absolutely macabre killings and also disrespecting corpses, and probably somebody who's guilty of more killings than he was ever recognised for, and yet he ends up in a situation and circumstance where his life is probably better, it feels really unfair. It feels like something has gone completely wrong. Yeah, you don't want him outside. You certainly don't want him to have access to any other human being because clearly he is a predator. But at the same time, that feeling of actually he's ended up in a better space and place paid for by the public, that is something that understandably can cause a lot of us those questions. On the 26th of July 1984, Gein died of complications that were a result of cancer. He was 77 years of age, and they actually buried him in Plainfield Cemetery, which kind of surprises me because, do you know, in the good old days, I take that back, they're not good old days. They were the days where potentially if you were a woman and somebody was like, she is a witch, they'd be like, she's a witch, let's just burn her, which were terrible old days and should certainly not come back. But there were these times where if you were a really terrible human being, and I'm sorry, Gein is a really terrible human being, they wouldn't let you in a cemetery. They'd be like, this person shall be laid to rest, I don't know, in a marsh, just dumped on top of a mountain where the birds can eat him. I don't know, but just not anywhere where there was kind of a religious intent. They were seen to have denied themselves the opportunity to ever be on consecrated ground. But he gets put in Plainfield Cemetery, and that grave ends up getting vandalised over the years. Weirdly, I say vandalised, but what I probably mean more is most of it was stolen. I don't know. Some people are so strange. They're like, I'm just going to go out today. I don't know. I've got an interest in, you know, crimes that have happened, so I'll probably just take a bit of Ed Gein's grave, take that home, put it on the mantelpiece. It's not bizarre, is it? I would always be one of those people that if I were taken home to see somebody's etching, shall we say, and they were like, yeah, this etching, it's one of Ed Gein's grave bits. I'd be like, oh, do you know what? I just realised that I have a dental appointment right now. I'm just, see ya. Do you know what I mean? Not something that would impress me. But the bit that they actually managed to recover, so the bits that still exist, actually that resides in a Wisconsin museum. Again, a little bit on the macabre side, but I guess in the end, they didn't want people to just be able to take more and more and more of the gravestone, and they also didn't want to give people the opportunity to constantly vandalise the graveyard. Now, this crime that I'm talking about today, these crimes, I should say, they provided a hell of a lot of inspiration for films. So as well as Hitchcock's Psycho, Gein's crimes also allegedly inspired the cult horror of the 1970s, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. And basically the Texas Chainsaw Massacre is where a family home is just filled with furniture made from human body parts. Also chainsaw-wielding Leatherface, because he wears a mask made from one of his victims' faces. These are all characters that have been derived apparently from these crimes. Also inspired the character Buffalo Bill. That was the serial killer in Silence of the Lambs, one I remember well, who was terrifying. Keep putting the lotion over you so it makes your skin more easy to remove. No teenager needs to have that running through their mind, but literally that's again the one that they compare with. He would skin his victims, and the reason for Buffalo Bill skinning his victims was he wanted to make himself into a woman. He wanted to wear their flesh in that way. So again, he bears that complete connection, apparently, to the case that I'm talking about today. There've been lots and lots of theories about, why Gein acted the way that he did, and lots of people explaining the bizarre and the disturbed psychology that this man carried. I think we can all agree that clearly his mother was a major influence in Gein's life and in his development. And some people have theorised, some professionals have theorised that her behaviour basically emasculated him. It emasculated him from the get-go, so from early childhood. And also he was indoctrinated because of her views towards his father, and also when she belittled he and his brother, that males were weak in his opinion. So he saw male role models and male peers as lesser than women. And we can agree, his father was weak. And to some degree, people believe that this made him want to be more like his mother, that Gein wanted to be powerful. So that's why he made the female skin suit. And it could be argued that, to be fair, the mother's views that she absolutely was very open about on women and just people in general caused Gein simply not to see other human beings as people whatsoever. Instead, to be pumped full of that rhetoric about them being evil, immoral, animal sinners. And I'll be honest with you, when you look at how he treated his victims, you kind of think that you can support that contention, can't you? He gutted them, he skinned them, he then used their body parts. Basically, he did treat his victims the way that people treat animals. And we know that women had absolutely no interest to Gein on a sexual level. He didn't want an intimate relationship with a woman. In fact, I think we could say he didn't really want a relationship with anybody, not even a friend. And his mother had taught him from the get-go that women were vessels of sin. So to Gein, they were just used as spare parts. They were used as spare parts with one intention: to recreate the one woman who was in Gein's eyes truly virtuous and truly worthy. It was all about using the spare parts of those women to create the one that he had meaning towards: his mother. Gein, as I said earlier on, he was often referred to as a necrophiliac, but he maintained throughout his incarceration until his death, consistent with his assertion that he never had sex with any of the corpses in his possession. It seems as if he literally had no interest as far as sex was concerned. And he even stuck to the promise that he made to his mother and remained a virgin. So it doesn't even seem that when he was wearing the woman's suit that he'd made, that it gave him any form of sexual gratification. Instead, it's as if putting that suit on somehow in that moment resurrected his mother, or at least gave him the female form that represented what she meant to him. And remember, she, from the very early stages of his life, had taught him to be ashamed of his male body. So by wearing that female form, he escaped himself. Also, there was the claim that Gein was a cannibal, but there was absolutely no evidence of this. Over the years, this has become fiction. Now, investigators did find, and they found a lot of it, mummified, rotting, actually even fresh steaming body parts in Gein's house. But Bernice's Woden's heart was not in the pan or on the stove, because people claim that it was. It wasn't. It was in a plastic bag in front of the stove. Also, her organs were not in the fridge. Her entrails that they found, and the entrails that they found were actually still warm at the time. They'd been wrapped in newspaper. They'd been folded inside an old suit of men's clothes. So Gein wasn't keeping cool so he could cook them later on at all. Gein also was very open in admitting to most of the crimes that he committed, but cannibalism, just like necrophilia, was not one of them. I suppose the question that we all have to ask when we're looking at Ed Gein, the serial killer, the body snatcher, is, was he born mentally ill? Or is it that his life experiences, which were pretty diabolical and toxic, actually led to causing this decline? I mean, it's a debatable point, isn't it? He clearly had a traumatic, abusive upbringing. He was definitely psychologically and emotionally and physically abused by his mother. He was also physically abused by his alcoholic father. He was isolated. He was denied human contact. He was denied normal social interactions that most children take for granted. He was taught that the world was a really evil, dangerous, sinful place, that people were evil. And bizarrely for him, he would have experienced and encountered those lessons that were primarily given to him by his mother as her way of protecting him from the perils of this horrific outside world. His dysfunctional home life that had been created for him by both parents also led him to be rejected, ridiculed, and made fun of and bullied by his peers. And that's on top of those physical defects that I talked about, the way his speech impediment affected him, the way his eye affected him. So whether the, shall we say, damage to his mental health was inflicted early on, or whether it actually manifested itself following the death of his entire family in such a short space of time, although we've got to acknowledge that the likelihood is he did murder his brother, so arguably was there some murderous intention there prior to when his mother died, or arguably could we say he murdered his brother to punish him for failing his mother potentially, so he could have seen that as a virtuous killing. The truth is we're never really going to know, are we? But it certainly seems that the violent adult behaviour and the warped desires that he ended up manifesting must have had some fuel given to him by his childhood experiences. I guess the other thing that we could look at with Gein, talking about his lack of sexual interest, is to some degree, is it that his mother was able to satisfy these urges? Now, there's absolutely no suggestion whatsoever that there was an incestuous relationship with Gein and his mother, but he worshipped her. So you could, I guess, argue that it seems like a classic Oedipal complex. So to Gein, Augusta was a goddess. You know, no other woman would ever be able to compete with her perfection. And that was how he held her in this esteem that no one could reach that bar. It's clear that his older brother absolutely felt that their relationship was really unhealthy, and voicing those concerns to Gein was probably one of the reasons that he lost his life. We also can note, and this is very telling as far as I'm concerned, that Gein had this constant desire for his mother's presence even after her death. And that's illustrated in the manner of his crimes. He killed women that resembled her. He robbed the graves of women that were around her age. He exhumed her body, preserved her head. He created a suit out of her skin just so he could become her. He kept all her rooms sealed off so that they were a permanent shrine to her. Without his mother, it's like Gein felt he was nothing. She'd created his identity. And it's like he never knew where she ended and where he began. So when she died, his whole identity died with her. And I think that this is likely the thing that really sent him spiraling into insanity. And the other problem that we have when she dies that adds to this problem is she had this very strict code of rules, regulations, and expectations, and he was so in awe of her, he idolized her, that he maintained who he was because of who she was. But when she was no longer there, if he had these warped desires in his mind, then there was literally not one person around to keep those warped desires in check. And subsequently, the Butcher of Plainfield was born, one of the most notorious killers of all time. Oh, it's been a really interesting one today. I didn't know whether I'd enjoy researching this case because I've read about this particular murderer and I've seen films that obviously are meant to relate to him, but it's been really, really intriguing for me, particularly the fact that people were so interested in buying the macabre items that were auctioned off, because it says something, doesn't it, quite strange about certain elements of humanity. Not that I'm judging people who do that. Everyone's got a weird interest, haven't they? But I wonder what you think, whether you believe that he was an individual who was always going to end up this way, or whether he was so affected by the loss of his family that it triggered the actions and the consequences that we've seen. Also, it's quite surprising, isn't it, to know that this guy who was so incredibly malicious to his victims ended up being considered a pretty decent man whilst he was incarcerated. He never caused them any problems whatsoever. So again, if he hadn't lost his mother in those circumstances of that age, would we ever have seen these crimes play out? Although it's clear that he had the interest, isn't it? You know, at the end of the day, I don't know many people who are just like studying how Nazis did medical experiments on poor innocent victims and having a penchant for learning about anatomy, you know, just in the case of the opportunity to cut somebody's head off and shrink it. Who knows? Let me know if you found this video interesting. Give me a like, give me a comment, subscribe if you will. I release my content on a Wednesday and Sunday. Crime and consistency is my catchphrase. Also, new merch is out. This is a nice red Bang to Rights one. I do love these. I love them. See you soon, guys. Be safe.